Big Shaq never paid attention to street singers until he heard her. A voice so haunting, so full of pain it froze him in place. But behind the melody was fear, a past she couldn't escape. When she vanishes, Shaq digs deeper, only to uncover a dangerous man who silences those who try to leave. Now, the hunter has become the hunted. And Shaq? He's about to end the game for good. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city never sleeps. Neon lights flicker against the glass windows of high-rise buildings, and the hum of traffic blends with distant sirens. Pedestrians move in waves, business people rushing home, couples strolling hand in hand, street vendors calling out their last sales of the night. The air is thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, car exhaust, and the faint trace of rain from earlier in the evening. Big Shaq walks among them, his step steady, his mind elsewhere. He's used to tuning out the world, filtering distractions, and focusing only on what matters: his empire, his deals, his next move. But tonight, something cuts through the noise. A sound unlike anything else. A voice. It starts soft, almost blending into the city's symphony. But then it rises, haunting, raw, and full of something that grips him by the chest. He stops mid-step, brows furrowing as he turns toward the source. A girl sits on the sidewalk, a small guitar resting on her lap, her fingers lightly strumming the strings. She doesn't have a microphone, doesn't need one. Her voice carries on its own, pulling people in like a tide. Her song isn't just melancholic. It bleeds. It holds a story, a pain so palpable it makes Shaq's skin prickle. Passers-by toss loose change into the open guitar case beside her, but no one really looks at her. They hear her, admire her talent, and move on. But Shaq doesn't move. Something is off. He watches closely, the way her hands tremble slightly, the way her eyes seem to focus on nothing, like she's not really here but somewhere else entirely. She sings like someone who's lost everything. And suddenly, it's not just the voice that haunts him, it's the silence between the notes. When the song ends, there's a brief pause before scattered claps and murmurs of appreciation. The girl gives a small nod, but there's no smile, no warmth, just exhaustion. Shaq steps forward. "You've got a voice that could fill stadiums," he says, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. She doesn't look up right away. Her fingers trace the rim of the guitar case, eyes flickering to the few crumpled bills inside before finally landing on him. "Thanks," she says, her voice quieter now, guarded. Shaq studies her. She looks young, early 20s at most. Her dark hair falls messily around her face, strands sticking to her cheek. There's a smudge of dirt near her wrist, her clothes worn but not entirely ragged. Not a lifelong street performer. More like someone who wasn't meant to be here. "What's your name?" he asks. A pause. "Lena," she says finally. Shaq doesn't miss the hesitation. It's subtle, but telling. A flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. He nods, but he doesn't believe her. "You always play out here?" he asks, keeping his tone light. "Sometimes." She shrugs, adjusting the strap of her guitar. People like music. It helps them escape for a while. Shaq tilts his head. "And what about you?" Lena tenses. "What about me? Do you sing to escape?" For a split second, something cracks in her expression. But then just as quickly it's gone, replaced by a carefully practiced indifference. "I sing because I have to," she mutters, glancing away. Shaq doesn't push, but he doesn't look away either. This isn't just about music. Another gust of wind rushes past, and Lena subtly pulls her jacket tighter around herself. That's when Shaq notices the bruises. Faint, just above her wrist, barely visible under the dim streetlights. Finger marks, the kind that don't come from accidents. Shaq feels something cold settle in his chest. "You hungry?" he asks suddenly. Lena's fingers tighten around the edge of her guitar case. It's a small reaction, but it confirms what Shaq already suspects. "I'm fine," she says. Shaq doesn't buy it. He doesn't miss the way she stole a glance at a nearby food stand just minutes ago, the way her breath hitched slightly when he asked. "Come on," he says, nodding toward a diner across the street. "I was gonna grab a bite anyway." Lena hesitates. She doesn't trust easily, that much is clear. But the hunger outweighs the caution, and after a long pause, she nods. All right, she says. But I'm not a charity case. Shaq smirks. Never said you were? They walk across the street, stepping into the warm glow of the diner. It's quiet inside, only a few late-night customers scattered across booths. A waitress glances up, giving Shaq a familiar nod. He's been here before, after long work nights when he needed a moment to breathe. Lena slides into the booth across from him, her fingers still lightly gripping her guitar as if she's afraid someone might take it. Shaq orders without looking at the menu. Burger, fries, and a milkshake. Then he looks at Lena. What about you? She hesitates, eyes scanning the menu too quickly. Same, she says. Shaq doesn't call her out on it, but he knows she just picked the safest answer. She's used to survival mode. When the food arrives, she eats fast, but not like someone who has no manners, more like someone who doesn't know when their next meal will be. Shaq doesn't say anything, just watches. After a while, he leans forward, elbows resting on the table. So Lena, he says, voice casual but intent clear. Who are you running from? The question hangs between them. Lena stiffens, the fry halfway to her mouth frozen in midair. For a second, her mask slips, and in that moment, Shaq sees it. The fear, the exhaustion, the weight of something she's been carrying alone for too long. She sets the fry down, pushing the plate away slightly. I should go, she mutters. Shaq doesn't stop her. He just watches as she slings the guitar over her shoulder and moves toward the door. But before she leaves, she glances back at him, something unreadable in her eyes. Stop looking for me, she says softly. It's better that way. And then she's gone. Shaq exhales, running a hand over his face. But he knows one thing for sure. He's not letting this go. The diner's warmth was a stark contrast to the cold night outside. The scent of coffee and grilled burgers filled the air, but Shaq wasn't focused on the food. His attention was on Lena. She sat across from him, shoulders slightly hunched, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if ready to bolt at any second. She wasn't relaxed. Even here, in a quiet booth with no immediate threat, she looked like someone who had spent too long running. Shaq slid a crisp $100 bill across the table. Here, get yourself a place to stay for the night. Lena barely glanced at it before shaking her head. I don't take money. Shaq frowned. You're sleeping on the street, Lena. She pushed the bill back toward him. I don't sing for money, she said, her voice steady but quiet. I sing because I have to. The way she said it, it wasn't just a preference. It was a rule she lived by. Shaq studied her, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she reached for her drink, fingers tapping lightly against the glass, her gaze fixed on the table. Avoidance, deflection. He let it go, for now. Instead, he waved down the waitress. Another burger, he said, and extra fries. Lena's posture tensed slightly. I didn't ask for... I know, Shaq interrupted. But you need it. She hesitated. Then reluctantly, she nodded. When the food arrived, she ate fast but controlled. Not like someone unfamiliar with hunger, but like someone who had learned how to eat quickly before the food was taken away. Shaq leaned back, watching her. How long have you been out here? Lena wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, hesitating. A while. You got family? Silence. Shaq waited, but when she finally spoke, her voice was clipped. Not anymore. He didn't miss the flicker of pain that passed through her eyes. You're not from around here, are you? He pressed. She shook her head. Does it matter? It does if you're in trouble. Lena exhaled sharply, pushing her plate away as if she had suddenly lost her appetite. Why do you care? Shaq didn't answer right away. Maybe it was because of her voice, the way it stayed with him long after the song had ended. Maybe it was the way she moved, constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting someone to be there. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something he rarely allowed himself to remember. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I do. Lena didn't say anything. She just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether or not he was safe. But then, when she thought he wasn't looking, she glanced toward the window. Her body tensed, checking for someone. Shaq followed her gaze, but there was no one outside. Just cars passing, the city moving on as if nothing was wrong. But Lena saw something he didn't. When she turned back to him, her face had shifted. The walls were back up. "I should go," she said, grabbing her guitar case. Shaq frowned. "Lena? Thanks for the food." She cut him off, already standing. "But stop looking for me." And just like that, she was gone. That night, Shaq couldn't sleep. The penthouse was quiet, the skyline stretching before him through floor-to-ceiling windows. But all he could hear was her voice. It wasn't just the song. It was the weight behind it. The hesitation when she spoke. The way she flinched at kindness like she wasn't used to it. She was hiding something. And she was afraid. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through business emails, news alerts, anything to distract himself. But his thoughts kept circling back. Who was she running from? And why did he have a feeling that if he didn't find out soon, it might be too late? The city had a rhythm, a predictable pulse that Shaq had learned to navigate over the years. He had built his empire within these streets, watching businesses rise and fall, people come and go. But Lena didn't fit into that rhythm. She was an anomaly, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, always on the move, always looking over her shoulder. The next evening, he returned to the same spot where he had first heard her sing. The sidewalk was the same, the neon lights still flickered, and the vendors still called out to late-night pedestrians. But Lena was gone. Shaq scanned the area, his eyes moving over every face, every alley, every shadow. Nothing. He approached a street vendor selling roasted nuts on the corner. "The girl who sings here," Shaq said, keeping his voice casual. "You see her tonight?" The vendor shook his head, adjusting the heat on his cart. "She comes and goes. Some nights she's here, some nights she's not. Never stays long." "Any idea where she goes?" The vendor gave a small shrug. "Like she's hiding from something." Shaq's jaw tightened. He had already suspected it, but hearing it from someone else made it real. Lena wasn't just avoiding people, she was running. He wasn't the type to let things go. His instincts wouldn't allow it. Something wasn't right, and he needed to know why. Shaq spent the next few nights looking for her. He checked security cameras from nearby businesses, using his connections to gain access. He watched how she arrived, how she left. Always the same pattern, never staying in one place too long. The moment she was done singing, she vanished into the city, slipping through streets and alleyways like a ghost. By the third night, he finally found her. It was past midnight when he turned down a quiet alley, the dim glow of a broken streetlight barely illuminating the cracked pavement. There, curled up against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her guitar case, was Lena. She was asleep, but not peacefully. She twitched slightly, her brows furrowed, as if trapped in a dream she wanted to escape from. Shaq took a step closer, his voice low but firm. "Lena." She startled awake, her eyes wild with fear before she registered who was standing in front of her. For a moment, she just stared at him, her breath coming fast. "I told you to stop looking for me," she whispered. Shaq crouched down, his gaze steady. "Who are you running from?" Lena's hands gripped the fabric of her jacket. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Shaq didn't rush her, didn't press. He could see the battle in her eyes, the war between wanting to trust someone and the fear of what might happen if she did. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she broke. "They'll find me," she said. Her fingers trembled against the worn strap of her guitar case. "And if they do, I'm dead." Shaq's stomach clenched. This wasn't just a girl down on her luck. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something he hadn't expected. A responsibility to protect her. The city stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Shaq's penthouse, a glittering maze of lights and motion. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of traffic below. Lena stood near the edge of the room, her posture tense, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't belong in a place like this. Not anymore. Shaq had promised her safety, but she still hesitated, scanning the penthouse as if looking for hidden traps. As if at any moment this safety might turn into another prison. "You're safe here," Shaq said, his voice steady. Lena exhaled slowly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She had spent so long running, hiding, keeping her story locked away. But something about Shaq, his calm, his patience, the way he had found her when no one else had bothered, made her believe for the first time in years that maybe she didn't have to run alone. So, she told him everything. She hadn't always been homeless. She used to have a future, a dream, a voice that people wanted to hear. At 18, she had signed with Damian Cross, a producer who promised the world. He was powerful, respected, untouchable. To the public, he was a genius, the man who made careers. To Lena, he was a nightmare. At first, everything seemed perfect. Studio sessions, industry parties, a team shaping her into the next big thing. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip. Damian controlled everything, what she sang, what she wore, where she went, who she spoke to. It wasn't mentorship, it was ownership. The first time she told him no, he smiled. The second time, he made sure she understood the consequences. He never hit her. He didn't have to. His control ran deeper than bruises. It was in the way people stopped returning her calls if she upset him. The way contracts disappeared overnight. The way she would show up to the studio only to find her songs given to another artist. And when she finally tried to leave, that's when she truly saw what he was capable of. Her name was erased. Bookings canceled. Money vanished. The industry shut its doors to her overnight. Then came the messages, the reminders. You don't exist without me. You can't run from me. And then, the final warning. A car following too close, a shadow in the hallway outside her apartment. A voice on the phone telling her she'd be better off if she just disappeared. So, she did. She ran. Left everything behind. No bank account, no phone, no paper trail. Just her guitar and the clothes on her back. She had been running ever since. By the time Lena finished, her hands were shaking. She gripped her sleeves as if trying to hold herself together. Shaq sat across from her, silent. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists, not with violence, but with controlled fury. He had met men like Damian before, men who believed power made them untouchable, who destroyed lives without consequence. But Shaq wasn't the kind of man to walk away. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself before he spoke. He controls the industry, the police, the people who should protect you. Lena nodded, her throat tight. There's no way out. Shaq's voice was calm, deadly in its certainty. There's always a way out. And he knew exactly what to do. Shaq had spent years building his empire, not just with money but with power, influence, and connections in places most people didn't even know existed. He had seen men like Damian Cross before, men who believed they were untouchable, who thought fear and control made them kings. But Shaq wasn't the type to look the other way. Not when he knew the truth. Not when Lena had already lost everything. So, he did what he did best. He started digging. The first step was uncovering the cracks. It didn't take long to confirm what he already suspected. Damian wasn't just dangerous, he was careful. Every legal document, every contract, every threat he made was buried beneath layers of protection. But Shaq had access to people who could find what others wanted to keep hidden. He hired private investigators, pulled financial records, traced payments made to silence people. And the more he found, the angrier he became. Bribed cops, lawsuits that mysteriously vanished, artists who had once been on the rise, only to disappear completely after trying to leave his control. But it still wasn't enough. They needed proof that no one could ignore. Lena sat across from him in the penthouse, her hands curled into fists in her lap. You don't have to do this, Shaq said. He meant it. He could find another way. A safer way. But Lena shook her head. I do. Her voice was steady, but there was something deeper in it. Something different from the fear she had carried for so long. I won't run anymore. Shaq studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. They set the plan into motion. Lena reached out to Damian. The message was simple, desperate. She told him she was tired of running, that she wanted to come back, that she had made a mistake leaving him. It didn't take long for the response. Meet me. One last chance. No mistakes this time. Shaq knew what that meant. Damien wasn't meeting her to welcome her back. He was meeting her to make sure she never ran again. The meeting was set at a luxury hotel, a private penthouse suite with no cameras, no witnesses. The kind of place where bad things happened behind locked doors and no one ever asked questions. But this time, Damien wasn't the only one watching. Shaq had his own people in place. The hotel staff had been paid off. The security team outside the room wasn't Damien's anymore. It was Shaq's. Every word spoken in that room would be recorded, streamed, saved. There would be no escape. Lena stood outside the suite door, her hands cold, her pulse hammering. Shaq stood beside her. You don't have to go in alone. Lena swallowed hard. I do. He didn't argue. Instead, he just handed her the small device, a recording transmitter hidden beneath the delicate fabric of her dress. She took a slow breath and stepped inside. Damien was waiting. He looked exactly the same. Tailored suit, expensive watch, a glass of whiskey in hand like he owned the world. But when Lena walked in, he didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. He looked satisfied. You finally got smart, Damien said, swirling the glass in his hand. Or did you just get tired of running? Lena forced herself to stay calm. I just want my life back. Damien chuckled. Your life? He set his glass down and took slow steps toward her. You don't have a life without me, Lena. She wanted to flinch. She wanted to run. But she didn't. Instead, she met his gaze. I made a mistake leaving. Damien smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You did. And now, we have to fix that. His hand reached for his pocket. Lena knew what was coming. But before he could take another step, the door burst open. Shaq stepped inside, flanked by two of his men. Damien barely had time to react before the TV screen on the wall flickered to life. And then, his own voice filled the room. She doesn't have a life without me. She made a mistake leaving. Now we have to fix that. Damien's face was drained of color. Shaq tilted his head. You were saying? Damien turned slowly, his confidence cracking. You set me up. Shaq shrugged. You walked right into it. Damien's hands clenched. You don't know who you're messing with. Shaq's expression didn't change. Neither do you. The door opened again. Two officers stepped inside. Shaq had made sure of it. The right people were watching. The ones Damien hadn't been able to buy. One of them held up a phone. We have everything we need. You're done, Cross. Damien's bravado shattered. He knew it was over. Shaq leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for Damien to hear. You don't own her anymore. And for the first time ever, Damien Cross looked afraid. Damien Cross had built his empire on control. Control over careers. Control over people. Control over fear itself. He didn't expect that to change. Not tonight. As he stepped into the dimly lit penthouse suite, his polished shoes clicked against the marble floor. He exuded confidence, his suit crisp, his watch gleaming under the golden chandelier light. He had won before he even sat down, or so he thought. He expected to see Lena sitting alone, small and afraid, ready to beg for a second chance. Instead, he found Shaq sitting beside her. Calm, still, unreadable. For the first time in years, Damien hesitated. Lena wasn't curled up like a frightened bird. She was sitting tall, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And Shaq? He leaned back slightly, exuding the quiet kind of authority that real power didn't need to announce. Damien's smirk flickered for a brief second before he recovered. Well, he drawled, stepping forward, pretending he was still in control. This is unexpected. Shaq didn't respond. Damien took a seat across from them, unbuttoning his jacket with deliberate ease. Lena, you always did have a flair for theatrics, he said, giving her a slow once-over. Running off, playing the poor little runaway act. I have to admit, it's been quite the show. Lena didn't flinch. Shaq's voice cut through the room like steel. We're not here for games, Cross. Damien chuckled, shaking his head as he reached for the whiskey glass that had been prepared for him. Games? That's funny. coming from a man who doesn't belong in this world. I own this business. I own everything that happens in it. He swirled the whiskey lazily. But I'll admit, I'm intrigued. Tell me, what exactly do you think you have on me? Shaq didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and tossed a folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. Damien's smirk didn't falter, but his fingers twitched slightly before he reached for it. He opened the folder, flipping through the documents. Bribed police. Payoffs to silence artists. Missing women who had once worked under his name. Damien let out a slow exhale, then closed the folder with an almost amused expression. You've been busy. Shaq leaned forward, his tone even. I know exactly what you are, Cross, and I know exactly what you've done. Damien clapped his hands together, shaking his head. And what? You think a few pieces of paper are going to take me down? He let out a soft chuckle, placing his hands flat on the table. You have no idea how this world works, do you? His voice dropped, turning sharper, darker. You think I haven't been through this before? I have judges in my pocket, cops who'd rather take my money than waste their time on some nobody singer. You don't bring down people like me. We make the rules. Shaq didn't flinch. He was waiting for this, waiting for Damien to believe one last time that he was untouchable. He gave the smallest nod toward the far wall. And then, the television screen flickered to life. A video feed appeared. Live. And then Damien heard it. His own voice. You don't have a life without me, Lena. You made a mistake leaving. Now we have to fix that. Damien froze. His body went rigid as he turned his head slowly toward the screen. His own words played back to him, echoing in the silent room. Shaq's voice was eerily calm. You were saying? Damien's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked at the whiskey glass in his hand, as if realizing too late that this was never his game to win. Then, for the first time that night, Lena spoke. You don't own me, she said softly. You never did. Damien turned to her, his face unreadable, his jaw clenched. You think this is over? His voice was quiet now, losing its bravado. Shaq held his gaze. It is for you. A knock on the door. Then, it swung open. 2 officers stepped inside, their expressions blank, professional. Shaq leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for Damien to hear. You don't own fear anymore, Cross. The officers moved forward. Damien stood suddenly, knocking the whiskey glass over. He looked between them, between Shaq and Lena, realization dawning. This was real. This is a mistake, he started, voice cracking just slightly. You don't understand who I am. One officer stepped behind him, pulling out handcuffs. Oh, we understand exactly who you are. They pulled Damien's hands behind his back. Panic flared in his eyes. No, listen. Shaq, we can talk. Whatever you want, I can fix it. Shaq stood, adjusting his cufflinks unbothered. You can't fix anything. Damien turned to Lena, desperation creeping into his expression. Lena, please. You don't want to do this. Lena stared at him for a long moment. Then she stood, stepping closer. You were right about one thing, she murmured. Damien's breath hitched. What? She leaned in. You don't bring down people like you. You make them destroy themselves. Damien's face paled. The officers led him toward the door. His protest grew louder, more frantic. No, wait, this isn't, you don't understand. The door shut behind them. And just like that, Damien Cross, the man who had spent years controlling everyone else's fear, was finally drowning on his own. Shaq exhaled, his hands still resting on the table. Lena didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. You meant it, didn't you? She asked softly. Shaq met her eyes. Meant what? That it's over. Shaq gave a slow nod. Yeah, it's over. Lena inhaled shakily, as if her body still wasn't sure whether to believe it. For the first time in years, she was free. The world outside had changed, but inside Lena, it still felt the same. Damien was gone, locked away, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own corruption. The shadow she had lived under for so long had finally disappeared. but she didn't know how to step into the light. She sat by the window of her new apartment, a small but warm space Shaq had helped her find. It overlooked the city, a skyline stretching endlessly, full of possibilities. But possibilities were terrifying. For years, her life had been about survival, moving, hiding, staying quiet. And now, for the first time, there was nothing to run from. And yet she still felt trapped. Shaq had done more than just give her a place to stay. He had helped her piece together a life, a bank account, an ID and her real name. A sense of security she had forgotten existed. But when he mentioned singing, Lena flinched. She shook her head, staring down at the coffee cup in her hands. "I can't." Shaq sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Why?" She exhaled shakily. "Singing was my prison," she whispered. Shaq leaned forward, his voice steady. "No," he said. "He was your prison. Your voice is yours." Lena didn't respond, because part of her didn't believe him. She had spent so long associating her voice with chains, with fear, with control. She didn't know if she could ever use it again and not feel like she was back in Damien's grasp. So she changed the subject, and Shaq let her, for now. Weeks passed. Lena started to rebuild, little by little. She found comfort in normal things, grocery shopping, taking walks without looking over her shoulder, existing without fear. But there was still a silence inside her. One night, Shaq handed her a flyer. It was for a private artist showcase. Small crowd, intimate, no pressure. He didn't tell her to sing. He just gave her the option. Lena stared at the paper for a long time. She didn't say yes, but she also didn't say no. The night of the showcase, Shaq arrived early. The venue was small, nothing flashy, just a dimly lit room with a stage, an old microphone, and a crowd of people there to listen. He wasn't sure if she'd come. Then, the lights dimmed, and Lena walked onto the stage. She moved slowly, as if unsure whether she belonged there. The crowd hushed, waiting. Shaq watched as she took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the microphone. And then, she sang. The first note was quiet, tentative, as if testing the air, testing herself. Then something shifted. The fear melted away. Her voice grew stronger, filling the space, not with pain, not with chains, but with freedom. Shaq exhaled, feeling something settle inside him. He hadn't just saved a girl. He had helped her rewrite her story. Your voice is your power. Never let anyone take it from you. Lena's story isn't just about music. It's about breaking free, fighting back, and reclaiming what was stolen. How many voices go unheard because fear keeps them silent? How many dreams are crushed before they even have a chance to begin? Stand up, speak out, protect those who need it. Because sometimes the difference between a lost soul and a rising star is just one person willing to listen. If you believe in second chances, in justice, in the power of standing up for what's right, share this story. Let the world hear it.